The basic idea is it's a sports stock market. You can invest in athletes like stocks. The app is live in New Jersey, so anyone can live in New Jersey to trade and deposit, but anyone in the country can download it and it can experience it. And hopefully what you'll find is that it kind of looks like Robinhood or Coinbase, but instead of seeing, companies like Amazon or Google or crypto, you see athletes and there's prices next to the athlete. And it's a very intuitive interface.
Business casual.
If you're a fan of sports, there are more and more ways to make real money off of your fandom and sports knowledge. The sports betting industry in the US is booming. In 2021, the American gaming industry reported $57.2 billion in handle. That's another way of saying the amount of money wagered, which amounted to $4.29 billion in revenue. That is pretty jaw-dropping, considering it was only 4 years ago that the Supreme Court ruled that states could decide for themselves whether they wanted to legalize sports betting. It is now legal in some form in 35 states and in Washington, D.C. Serial entrepreneur Vinit Bharara is looking to capitalize on this boom with his company, Mojo, a new sports stock market backed by billionaire entrepreneur Mark Lowry and entrepreneur and former baseball player Alex Rodriguez. Unlike gambling, which Vinit described as all or nothing, Mojo functions more along the lines of the financial markets, like E-Trade meets ESPN. Mojo lets fans invest in an athlete's on-field performance like a stock, and the value or price of an athlete is based on hard metrics, including predictions of an athlete's stats at the end of their career. Mojo has officially launched in New Jersey with the plan to expand to other states in the near future. This was a fun convo. Vinit is super sharp and an expert at building wildly successful companies, including launching Diapers.com with Mark Lowry, which sold to Amazon for over $500 million, and launching media company Some Spider Studios, which got acquired for $150 million. And now he is tackling sports. Vinny, I'm very excited to chat with you. Welcome to Business Casual, and congrats on the launch of Mojo. This is so great.
Thank you very much.
Before we get into it, I would like to start with an icebreaker for a segment called OG Occupations. You've had a lot of different jobs in your life, Vinny. So I want you to go back in the memory bank and tell me what your very first job ever was in your life.
It's a good question. I was just thinking about this because I was with my kids in New Jersey. So I grew up in New Jersey, and the first job I ever had was at ShopRite, the supermarket, and I used to do the carts, in the parking lot where you kind of aggregate the carts and put them to the front. And I really think that I was probably 10 years old, because I do know that at 11 years old, I was delivering a paper called the Asbury Park Press. And so this had to have been before. So I think I was 10.
10 years old pushing shopping carts. You're not our first guest for whom that was their first job. It was also pushing carts, and they really loved it and enjoyed it. Did you enjoy it?
I didn't like it. No, I didn't like it. But it must have been the go-to back then. And I remember because it was like in a little, by the way, the ShopRite still exists. It's very close to where I grew up. My parents have moved. But within the same kind of confinement of stores, there's a pizza store, like a pizza shop it used to be called Attilio's. And so what I really remember was that, I would do this thing. It started at maybe 10 a.m. and all I looked forward to was like my lunch at noon or 12:30, because I would eat this Attilio's pizza, and I still remember how good that was. And I hated the job, but I loved the pizza.
It is those meals that really stick out to you in early jobs. So it's funny you mentioned pizza, because as you know, I used to work at Jet.com, which Mark Lowry founded. We have Mark Lowry in common. He's a co-founder of Mojo. You started Diapers.com with him. There is a pizza shop in Montclair, New Jersey. We shared the parking lot with that pizza shop called Uppies for our very first janky Jet.com office. And every conference room, every conference room smelled like pizza. You get a waft of it when you cross the parking lot to go from conference room to conference room. And that's like one of my best memories of working at Jet is the pizza. It's important.
It's got to be like food. As you know, having worked with Mark, food is like the center of a lot of what he thinks about, which is obviously his business. But I was just at lunch with some coworkers prior to this interview, and I told them that when I was working with Mark, we would go to lunch every single day. We would make sure we got out of the office. to do lunch, and that was the center. That was like a really big part of the day, including in Montclair. They didn't have that restaurant, I think, when we worked there, but yeah, food, lunch. I think it's not a bad thing when you're working at a startup to make sure you get that hour
Yeah.
or 45 minutes to take lunch.
And for those of us who work from home, let this be a reminder. You still need a lunch break, even if you're working from your house. Yes. Okay.
100%.
Let's get into Mojo. Vinny,
Yeah.
the idea of a sports stock market is an idea you've had for a long time. And you started The Pit with Mark Lowry, which was a sports card stock market. So take me back to the beginning of that. Why did you want to combine the world of sports with betting before sports betting was legal in the US?
No, so yeah, we were younger back then. This was in the late 90s. I was still a lawyer working at a big law firm. And Mark, as you know, you worked with him. He was my best friend growing up, but there was also another best friend we had. His name was Lax Chandra. We all went to high school in New Jersey. And we were just big sports fans. And back then, the internet was pretty new. It wasn't that old. I think it was 1998 or so. And we had this idea as sports fans that we thought it would be pretty cool if you could have regular people like us invest in athletes like stocks. And E-Trade was kind of like a big company at the time, and eBay was too, and ESPN, of course. And so we thought, what if you could like merge E-Trade with ESPN and create this like amazingly exciting stock market where the prices of players basically fluctuated based on how they performed on the field. And that was the premise. And so we went to counsel, and the lawyers said, if you do it right, do it the way you want to do it, and it's super successful, you may have some legal issues, because there's no regulatory framework to do it. There's no online wagering is not legal, and this could be construed of as wagering. And so there was some question about that, but we decided to be super safe, and instead, as you said, basically create a sports card stock market where the trading card, was a proxy for the athlete. And it would still allow the user to invest in athletes like stocks, but there was this physical asset that they were instead investing in. So that was why we did it, and we can get into like how it worked and all, but that was the sort of the idea.
I want to get into how Mojo works, because now you have the regulatory framework is in place. So Mojo is this stock market for athletes driven by actual stats, predictions for an athlete's career-ending stats. Can you walk me through what the user experience is as someone who is investing in these athletes, and what decisions you are making as a user along the way?
Yes, great question. So, like you said, the basic idea is it's a sports stock market. You can invest in athletes like stocks. The user experience, the app is live in New Jersey, so anyone can live in New Jersey to trade and deposit, but anyone in the country can download it and it can experience it. And hopefully what you'll find is that it kind of looks like Robinhood or Coinbase, but instead of seeing companies like Amazon or Google or crypto, you see athletes, and there's prices next to the athlete, and it's a very intuitive interface. And you can go long or you can go short. And when you go long in an athlete, you're of course hoping that price will increase. And when you go short, you hope the price decreases. And the sort of foundation of it is that the price is basically a projection of where the end of the career will be for that athlete. So the really, really important sort of economic concept that's very different than what we did 20 years ago. And this is credit to Mark, I think. Like, he's such a genius, as you know, when he thinks quantitatively. And the very big sort of thing that you got to remember is that on Mojo, there's this thing that we call intrinsic value. And you didn't really have that 20 years ago. What we mean by intrinsic value is if you own stock in any player on Mojo, we guarantee the owner of that stock a payout based on that athlete's career-ending statistics. That's really important, because you now know if you buy that stock and you hold it and don't trade it, that it will have actual value based on something objective and immutable. And that didn't exist in the trading card industry, or even currently in NFTs or all kinds of things, because it's like you buy this thing, and as you know, like you don't really know what it's worth. It could be worth nothing, because it's based on purely supply and demand, and what the result of that is that you see these booms and busts in these assets, and they're not connected to like something intrinsic to the thing you're buying. And we wanted to make sure we solved that. And so that's why we created it that way here, very different from 20 years ago. And that's kind of the anchor of what you trade. Now, doesn't mean you have to hold the stock to retirement. No one's going to want to hold this thing to retirement. So the second thing that we wanted to do was create liquidity so that this asset that you know that has intrinsic value, it's anchored in something real. Now you want to make sure that you can trade it like whenever you want and that there's a price for it and there's liquidity, which also doesn't exist in a lot of markets. So the second really important thing we had to do was to do that in the beginning when there's not millions and millions of users, so there's a chicken and egg problem, so we had to build a whole market making infrastructure. That's why we have all these quantitative folks that are ensuring that there's a price at all times for the user to get in and out of, and that price is basically what the latest expectation is of where the career will end for an athlete.
It is very quantitatively driven, objectively driven, but the design is also quite beautiful, if I can say that. And you mentioned that it looks familiar to, say, a Robinhood or a Coinbase. How important was familiarity of design when you designed the app itself so that people aren't confused and they're trying to learn something totally new, even though it is a new kind of market?
Super important. So we have an amazing design team led by a guy by the name of Anthony Cafaro. And there's so many things you have to get right. You know, every startup requires millions of things to go right for the customer to love the product. And the intuitive, simple, beautiful, very elegant interface was really important to us. And so we wanted it to feel familiar and we wanted it to be easy because it's like we are innovating here. This isn't something that exists in any way today. And so when you introduce something totally new to the customer, I think it's important for that experience to still anchor in something that's familiar. And I think Robinhood obviously did, an amazing job with their user experience. And so that was definitely some of the inspiration for how we thought about creating our app.
So on the pricing of it all, share prices, as I understand it, it moves based on performance, news, anything else that affects the market's expectations for the career-ending value for the athlete. So that's relatively objective. And the Mojo value is calculated on specific metrics like 10 yards, first downs, touchdowns when you're talking about the NFL. Help me understand how that is different from regular stocks, which are partially based on objective company stats, but there's also sentiment and optimism, speculation, FOMO, what the rest of the market is doing. So how much of the Mojo market is driven by tangible, infallible metrics versus human perception and speculation?
No, it's a great question. And when we think about this as compared to the regular stock market, the first thing we wanted to do was make it as close as possible. So we want to, and in the regular stock market, I was just having this conversation a couple of hours ago. I do think that there's intrinsic value in the regular market. So if you own stock in a company, Amazon or otherwise, you are, that there's earnings and revenue behind that company, and it's not the same as an NFT, as an example, or a trading card. So there is intrinsic value, I think, built into the regular stock market. At the same time, like you said, the way prices move don't necessarily always correlate directly to that intrinsic value. There are other factors that can create a price movement or a drop in your stock that's somewhat independent of that specific stock's performance. So, inflation obviously is going on. Like your company, the company that you own stock in could be doing really well, but for some reason the price could be going down because of something external. That happens all the time in the financial markets. And I think in our market, because there's this guaranteed payout that is based on the end of the career statistics, that's even more of an anchor to kind of make sure the price doesn't get out of whack and delivers like on this user promise that we have, which is to the regular person, hey, look, if you picked the right player and thought that his performance was going to be better than expectations, you will win. Like the price will go up. It'll more directly tie to that. And that was really important to us, just to the basic person, to the average sports fan, that you could deliver on that promise. You can't always deliver on that in the regular stock market. You really can't deliver on it in what we were in trading cards or in some of these other sort of newer assets like NFTs. And on our market, we're hoping that we execute that well.
What goes into the prediction of what an athlete's career ending stats will look like? How do you come up
When
with
we
that?
first, yeah, when we first set the price, that there isn't any market at all. There's no users coming in. Like, so when we debuted this a week ago, it's our own internal team, setting the price. And there's actually a price that users can buy at and sell at. So there's a check there on, like, if you don't like the price, you can always go short, or you can go long. So that's one nice check, I think, for the user, just to kind of, like, if they don't like it, again, you can go the other way. But our team of market makers and data scientists and traders studied, millions and millions of transaction data. When I say games, plays, to sort of backtest, what it should look like based on where the player is today to set the opening price. And then, once we launch, the prices move based on a lot of different things, but it's always based on what the expectation of where their career is going to end. But we now have signals coming in after launching from the public. So the public itself is a really important, maybe the most important signal of how prices move, because what we're trying to do is, we're the platform, we're really trying to kind of have some equilibrium of buyers and sellers. And that's like the price that we want to, because then at that point, we're balanced as a book. And our revenue model is mostly taking a commission on the transaction. So after we launch a player, it's really like the public, in many ways, fundamentally, where the public is where the price is settling, because it's where we can find an equilibrium of buyers and sellers, if that makes sense.
Vinny, you mentioned that you have done, obviously, your team has done a lot of quantitative analysis. There's a ton of historical data to look at. You also backtested. You backtested and simulated the return for Tom Brady, which I think is fascinating. If you were to have invested early on in Tom Brady, what did you find in that case? And how does that indicate the kinds of returns you could get if you invested in a really good player very early on?
Yeah, so Tom Brady is sort of the perfect example. 6th round pick when he came out of college from Michigan. Wasn't, no one knew that he was going to become the player he became, and that happens every day today. So when we go back, 20 years ago, our team thought that his price would be kind of close to $3 or so, and that would be the projection of where his career would end, because at the time, you didn't even know if he was ever going to really be a starter, right? As a 6th round pick, who wound up being the greatest player of all time, of course. And his price now is about $175, I think. I didn't check it today. Around 175, 180. So a 60x return on Tom Brady if you had gotten in super early. And that's before some of the features that we have on the platform, where you could multiply. You could choose multipliers and these like boosters during his career, where you could make even a multiple of the 60x. So that's kind of, that's a big part of Mojo, is get in early on younger players when their expectations are low. It's a very basic concept: buy low, sell high. And the younger players whose futures are super uncertain, who aren't locks as they call it, are going to have lower prices. And if you get that right, you're probably going to make a big X. And you can also, the opposite, short, players who everyone thinks are going to be great.
I'm really interested in the multiplier tool that you referenced, because it makes it more exciting, more volatile for a relatively safe career. You can get a big return on it if you really believe in that person. So how do you go about coming up with those features and doing the research?
The reason we had the multiplier is we thought, even in the stock market, you have options and derivatives, which can allow you to accelerate your return faster, because you think you're right. So you want to make, if you're right, you want to make a multiple of that. Let's say the price on the stock was going to move 2%, or even the S&P or something like that. Maybe you want, in the next 30 days or 60 days, to make some multiple on that in the regular stock market. Well, that's how you would use, puts or calls and stuff. So this is like our first attempt to do something kind of similar to the regular stock market, where we call it a multiplier. And it's a very basic thing where we just multiply the returns, the profits or losses of what it would ordinarily be. So if in the normal market, our normal market, the player would be up 5%, after a week. If you took a 10x multiplier, it means that your return would be, if you went long, 50%. And on the vice versa, like if you went long and he's down 5%, you'd be down 50%. So there are all these similarities, obviously, between the stock market itself, the financial stock market, and gambling. So that kind of makes this whole thing kind of super interesting. But we do think more along the lines of kind of how the financial markets work, and a little less gambling mentality, because that's really all or nothing. And you can do parlays and all this other stuff. It's not really the mentality that we're necessarily trying to feed.
Is there then a plan to offer things like puts and call options, even ETFs where you can buy into multiple athletes? Are you looking into those vehicles as well?
Yeah. Well, so the multiplier is a version of again, we sort of to your question earlier, a lot of what we're trying to do is make this easy for the user and demystify it and not complicate it. Some of these, doing an option or a put, it is accelerating your profits or losses and allowing you to take more risk. But some of that may be confusing to the average fan. And so we are trying to do some of those things, but doing it in a way that's easy to understand. That's how the multiplier is working. So we are thinking about sort of the substance of an option and doing it, of course, correctly and within the regulatory framework we're in. But again, trying to do this in a simple way. So that's kind of what this multiplier is. This ETF thing, very easy for us to do, where if you want to buy all the Jets players or all the Giants players, you can do that right now, obviously by just choosing all of those players. Well, we can probably make that easier, or with one button, you get all of them. And there's just super interesting kinds of like ETF cohorts, packaged together. That's more of a UX thing, but we can obviously do that. We talk about that all the time.
Very cool. On the subject of volatility, would anything drive up the price aggressively and very quickly on an athlete? And on the flip side, would anything tank the price, like an injury, or is it a relatively not volatile asset class that we're working with here?
No, it can definitely be volatile. So we've seen in the first 3 weeks of the NFL season, players will go up. Some players have gone up 15, 20, which I think is a big number before the multiplier, when they just significantly outperform an expectation. So there have been, like for example, I'm going to just talk about certain players that I know, that were up, 10%. For example, Devontae Smith, I'm an Eagles fan, so wide receiver for the Eagles. He's a younger kind of player. It's his second year. There's a lot of people think he's going to be, great, but in the first couple of weeks, he wasn't necessarily getting a lot of action. He had a breakout game last week on Sunday against Washington, and his price, I think, was up over 10%. It might even have been closer to 15%. And it's just because that was a game where the fans watched it, we watched it, and now you reset how you think about that player. Like you said, on the downside, Trey Lance, the quarterback for the 49ers, a couple of weeks ago had an unfortunate injury where he's out for the year. And as a result, he immediately dropped 15%. So you'll see these movements 5, 10, 15, even 20% in a week. That's before the multiplier. And it's all just anchored into this basic premise of like, did something happen with this player that was unexpected? So I think, that's what we're working with all the time, trying to make sure it's fun and exciting. Because at the end of the day, this is also an entertainment product, for users.
Yeah. So how has activity looked like so far? NFL season is underway. You launched, just a couple weeks ago in New Jersey. Is activity what you had expected going into this?
Yes, and it's beaten expectations. We haven't really done a lot of targeted marketing, but we're getting, we have thousands of downloads. I'm not going to give the detailed numbers, but I can say thousands of downloads, just a ton of trading activity. One of the things that's been interesting is to see, because the stock before you take the multiplier or otherwise is based on the career ending statistic, like that's how the prices move. There's been some question like, are people going to hold? Are they going to hold till the end of the career? We've seen a lot of action where folks have been trading in and out of their positions quickly. Like they're not waiting. There's a lot of folks, 24 hours, 48 hours are trading in and out of that position. We've only launched 9 days ago, I think. And so almost 20% of our positions that people have opened have been either closed or partly closed in less than 7 days. Some of these are within 2 days. So we're seeing this kind of like rapid turnover, which is an interesting metric for me to see, which kind of ties into the volatility. And then we're just seeing another kind of cool thing is if you do own stock, we're tracking, how often are you checking the app to see, just checking in on your stock, checking in on the movements. And we're seeing these amazing login metrics. Just, again, this is very early. It's only 9 days in, but just some indicator of whether folks think this is fun and engaging. Those retention login metrics are pretty spectacular.
9 days in as of this recording. When we publish this, who knows what could be different, Vinny?
Yeah.
It could be
Yeah.
tens of thousands of downloads. Vinny, let's get into the business of Mojo. As you mentioned, the primary source of revenue is commission on transactions. So does that mean higher volumes of trades are better for you? What is good for Mojo at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think, if you're just being straight quantitative, the revenue is a percent. The way we charge the transaction fee, it's a percent of your opening trade, and there might be a commission later also on the exit of your trade, but we don't have that right now. So the larger the trade, the more revenue we make, and obviously the more you turn over, the more you're trading yourself, there's revenue. So we're looking at frequency, which is really important, and also deposits and size of trades and that kind of thing.
So for any investing platform, there's, of course, this trade-off between education and frictionless transactions. So how do you educate users about the risks of buying the stock of these athletes or betting, essentially, versus making the process really easy and blocker-free? How do you balance those two things?
Yeah, education, like you said, is critical. You're introducing a very new product. It doesn't really exist, so we have to make sure people understand everything that I'm talking about. How the price is going to move, this whole thing that is based on the end of the career, the fact that it's intrinsic value, like there is something that you own that's objective. The multipliers, how do they work? So we're constantly figuring out how to think about, how to communicate these things in a super easy way. There is another factor, which I think you're sort of pointing out, which is regulatory-wise. We also want to make sure that people understand, what the risks are. You could easily lose money here. This isn't like you're going to definitely win money on Mojo. You got to get the players right. So we have to comply with the very clear regulations about what we communicate to customers around risk and responsible gaming. And so, you got to be 21 and older, and there's all kinds of things that are very clear about what we need to do that we comply with. But insofar as education, I think you're spot on that we have to wrestle every day with communicating and educating customers about how this thing works. I think one advantage, hopefully, that we have is that the prices are pretty intuitive. Like the way they move, it's just kind of player plays better than expected in a very macro sense. His price is going to go up. Player plays poorly than expected in a macro sense. Price is going to go down. And over time, you kind of can sense the magnitude of what those price movements are. So I think it's super intuitive in that way. And then also we've got all this content that we disseminate. We have all this content. The content's a big part of our business too that we can leverage, which also I think winds up educating the customer about how the market moves.
Yeah, and it feels like for sports fans who are getting involved in Mojo, understanding the stats of players is fundamentally easier because you're a sports fan. You've been tracking these metrics anyway. As you've been watching these players, maybe easier to understand than the fundamentals of some companies. So that's really interesting. So as you mentioned before, Mojo is a market maker as well, right?
Yeah, so we wanted to make sure at the very outset that there's liquidity, which means that a user comes in, they know like 2 seconds later they can get out. The only way to do that, in our view, like with, just guaranteeing that, is to ourselves take the risk and make sure there is a price for the customer. We did that 20 years ago also with the pit.
So are there any third parties involved in the transactions, or it's all fully transpiring within the Mojo ecosystem? I guess, can you walk me through what happens to a player's stock from click to transaction?
Yeah, the transaction's made with us, right? So you don't have to deal with anyone else. You open up you download the app. There's a quick process to sign up. You have to enter in some information in the same way with Robinhood and Coinbase to protect the customer. The regulations require some information to make sure that you're over 21, to make sure that you're within the state. And then at that point, just like Robinhood, Coinbase, even the wagering things, you deposit money and you just link your bank account. Once you got the money in your account, all the players are on there with a price, very easy to search. You pick a player, you hit go long, go short. You can enter in how much money you want to invest in that player. You'll get shares then as a result. And when you're doing that behind the scenes, that transaction is being made with Mojo directly as the counterparty. You're not dealing with anyone else. It's instant. It's guaranteed. Again, once you own the stock, you're entitled to this payout upon retirement. And then once you holding the stock, you have your portfolio. And if you're monitoring it, most of the people, as I said, aren't going to hold it till retirement. And so now you're just watching the price. And the price is the latest expectation of the career. And if you had gone long with the hope that from the time you bought the stock that the player is outperforming expectations, the price should go up. Yeah. And you can instantly hit the sell button. And that sell button, again, is directly with us as the counterparty, and it should be completely frictionless.
You make it sound so easy, but I'm sure there's lots of challenges in actually making that happen. And one of those challenges is going through the appropriate regulatory bodies, and you have to go state by state because, as we know, sports gambling laws are dependent on each state as decided by the Supreme Court. So how long does it take from when sports betting becomes legal in a state to then Mojo being functional in that state? How long? What does that look like?
Yeah. So for us, it's very specific. So it's sports wagering is already legal in over 20 states. I think it might even be almost 30 states now. But New Jersey's been legal for a couple of years. And so for us, again, very methodical. It's a little slower. This is definitely a complicated industry. And that process, though, does take several months, at least the first state, because the product didn't exist, that we had to educate these great folks at the DGE, the Division of Gaming, about what is this thing? How does it work? All the things we're talking about. And then they had to stress test it. And of course they have a million questions, rightfully so. How are you going to do this? And how are you going to have the reserve? And are you sure is it definitely an objective statistic? Because, that was really important, the immutability. The regulators wanted to make sure we couldn't mess around. So I think New Jersey as our first state took several months. The hope is that as we go to additional states, it will take shorter amount of time, but we'll see. And because they now can see the product in practice live, as opposed to us kind of showing it demos of how it could work. So I think the first state takes longer, but it did take us, many, many months, most of this year, to get that, firm approval. And then to actually, and you also, by the way, not only do you have to get the approval of the concept, then you have to build the technology that complies with all of the safeguards that they have. And then they get your technology and they test it. And they make sure, okay, you're definitely in the state. You can't trade outside the state. If you try to trade outside the state, it doesn't work. So they send people to New York and other places to make sure the trade doesn't work, and as they should, and got to make sure that the geofence, the age is working. You can't be under 21, and got to get the license. So there's a lot that goes into it.
Wow. I get it, because thinking about my Jet.com days, even little things like different tax rules from state to state, it's so complicated on the back end. So I feel you, Vinny, at a very small scale. I feel you. So I know you've gotten this comparison before, but things like the Hollywood Stock Exchange have existed, where you predict the rise and fall of movies, celebrities. Can this tech be applied to other industries eventually, where there are similarly metrics you can base values off of?
I don't think so, because you couldn't really do it the way we've described it until recently. Now that you have the new laws, the extension of what we're trying to do to other markets besides sports, it's really interesting. And I don't have the answer, because let's say you went beyond sports. The regulatory framework we're using is sports wagering, right? So I don't think we could use, but although I shouldn't, maybe we can, but I don't think you can use the sports wagering laws to do a field that's not sports. Now, that being said, I think it's possible, although I'm going to talk to the lawyers, about whether you could go to the CFTC and ask them. And that, in fact, in some ways easy, because it's you get federal approval. And so there's this company called Kalshi that you may have heard of, that's doing these futures contracts, but everything but sports. The main idea, though, is, I think that it's the right question, is, as the regulations and as people get smarter and stuff, the concept that we have where you can invest in a player, a person, in a very fun way that's based on objective intrinsic value in a market-like way where the prices are moving, and you can use your knowledge and analysis. I think it's a huge idea. Obviously, we're doing it in what we think is the biggest industry, sports, but it could be extended to things beyond sports. I do think that that's possible. You just got to figure out which regulation you use.
Okay, Vinny, before we let you go, a couple fun things. What is a big productivity hack that you could share with our listeners? The one thing that helps you just be more productive in your day?
I try to get, whether it's in the morning or at night, alone time with myself to think. And I feel, I'm not sure if everyone does that, but it could be something like you wake up, you go right to the office, you go right in, you go into all your meetings, and then you come out and you come back and you got dinner, whatever it is, and then you're doing you watch your Netflix and boom, you go. But for me, like there is this really important thing where you need to kind of have some time to think where you're not talking to anybody else. And in my apartment, I can do that in the morning when the kids go to school and my wife's out, and I can talk out loud. So I do that. And I find that that's where I'm most productive when I'm trying to think about something complex or something truly innovative. Like I kind of need this kind of, and Mark talks about that a lot too. It's like making sure you allot a certain amount of time to just think. Yep.
But I definitely don't do enough of that because you're always attached to some screen or your emails, your texts, or TikTok. So that's my reminder for today. It's just to spend more time thinking. Okay, final thing for you, Vinny. It's a game of this or that, NFL edition. So I'm going to name 2 players, and you have to choose which one you'd rather add to your Mojo portfolio or your fantasy lineup. And the caveat here is, Vinny, I don't know who most of these people are because I'm an honest person. I'm not really a football fan. Maybe I will be if I start trading on Mojo, but maybe you can educate me as we go. Okay, I do know the first pair, though. The first matchup, quarterbacks, we've got Joe Burrow or Patrick Mahomes. Who are you picking?
Yeah, it's a good question. So before the season started, I probably would have picked Joe Burrow coming off of the Super Bowl, like he was in the Super Bowl last year.
I knew that. Can you believe it?
Yeah, right. So there you go, right? So having watched the first 3 games of the season, and maybe I'm just being a fan here, I don't think Burrow's been, I mean, maybe he's a little overrated. I don't really know, but he hasn't, in my opinion, looked great, and Mahomes has looked spectacular. So just based on like sort of the recent 2022 season, I would go Patrick Mahomes.
Okay, Patrick Mahomes. All right, next up, we're going with veteran QBs. So you know where this is going. Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers?
Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers. Another good one. I should check their exact prices. I don't have them right in front of me, but just if you're asking me my instinct.
Yes, instinct.
I think I'd probably go Brady because I'm assuming, and I got to go check the price on Mojo, that what the expectation is in the public is that he's just going to play one more year. And I feel like with Brady, so if he plays more than 1 year, it's almost certain that the stock price would be higher. And I think with someone like Brady, it just feels like I've been so wrong about him retiring in prior years that just that dimension of him playing another year is like would make him a better bet or better investment than Aaron Rodgers. Okay. So, and also, like, you can never go wrong taking Brady.
All right. Never go wrong taking Brady. I love it. Next up, we're going with wide receivers. So Bengals wide receiver Jamar Chase or Vikings wide receiver Justin Jefferson.
Yeah. So I think here's my answer. My answer is going to be Jamar Chase, and here's the reason why. It's interesting a little bit because I was just talking about Joe Burrow. So Joe Burrow is the quarterback, of the Bengals, and Kirk Cousins is the quarterback of the Vikings. And part of how I would evaluate these receivers is their quarterback. Like, who's the better quarterback? Because that's going to affect, how many great, how many balls they get and how well the ball is thrown to them. And because Joe Burrow is, in my opinion, way better than Kirk Cousins, I think you got to take Jamar Chase, even though I think Justin Jefferson's amazing. But I just think with Kirk Cousins as the quarterback, you got to go Chase. So I go Chase based on Burrow. That's why.
Okay, wow. You're explaining this very well, even to someone who is not a fan of the NFL. Last one, we got some rookies. So we've got Breece Hall the Jets running back, or Devin Lloyd, the Jaguars linebacker. And I know Mojo doesn't have defensive players yet, but just roll with it. So Devin Lloyd or Breece Hall, rookies.
Yeah, so we don't, to your point. And so they're very different, two different positions and stuff. If we had the linebacker, it'd be kind of interesting. But I'm going to go, because we're based in New York, I'm going to take the local guy, Breece Hall, New York Jets. I'm not sure if I believe that or not, but I'm just going to do it anyway because we're in New York.
All right, for the loyalty. Okay, that was fun. I learned a lot about these NFL players, so we will leave things there. Vinny, thank you so much for talking to us about Mojo. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Nora.
This is Business Casual, and I'm Nora Ali. You can follow me on Twitter at Nora K. Ali. That's Nora, the letter K, Ali. And I would love to hear from you. If you have ideas for episodes, comments, and thoughts on episodes you loved, fun segment ideas, just shoot me a DM and I will do my very best to respond. You can also reach the BC team by emailing businesscasual@morningbrew.com or call us. That number is 862-295-1135. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Business Casual on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And if you like the show, please leave a rating and a review. It really helps us. Business Casual is produced by Catherine Millsop, Olivia Mead, and Raymond Liu. Additional production, sound design, and mixing by Daniel Marcus. Kate Brandt is our fact checker, and AB Silver is our senior booking producer. Sebastian Vega edits our videos. Our VP of Multimedia is Sarah Singer. Music in this episode from Daniel Marcus and the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. Thanks for listening to Business Casual. I'm Nora Ali. Keep it business and keep it casual.
Business Casual.
If you like what you saw and you like what you heard, you can listen to the entire episode of this podcast, Business Casual, anywhere you get your podcasts. And please go ahead and subscribe to the Morning Brew YouTube channel and go ahead and click on that alarm bell, that thing right there, so you can be alerted anytime there's a new video.